everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Doing good, doing good. Well, and we want to try to solve a few problems.
Let's do our best.
One thing, I think Jeff Dyson might have said it, that when people get hungry, maybe they'll wake up.
Yeah.
And we want to talk about, the potential, if not already, some shortages of food. And, I blame the use of the coronavirus as the excuse for the bad effects of the Federal Reserve monetary policy. But now that the farmers aren't producing and the food's not being distributed, it's all the farmers' fault. There's not a good organizer in Washington, and therefore we have to do something about it. One commentator on the radio I heard today said, well, there is a food shortage. There is a big problem. And the way she twisted it around was the agricultural department, because the virus came, and then you needed a manager, and that was Trump's responsibility. And Trump didn't central economically plan to make sure that the food would be delivered on time. Over the years, I never went to the store a whole lot, but I would. And I was always just really impressed with the produce. You could walk in there, even with bad times, inflation and things like that. Produce was so plentiful. It's always plentiful. And I keep thinking, some of this stuff came from our country, some from Central America, some from around the world, and it just arrives and it's in good shape, and average people get to buy this, and yet all of a sudden, boom, they're talking about food shortages. The only time I know about for sure in this country where there was a government-directed food shortage was in the Depression, because they interpreted the low prices there, which was deflationary, as a cause for higher prices solving the problem. So they wanted prices to go up, so they ordered the farmers to plow their crops under. But they're essentially doing some of that now. They're killing animals, but it's mainly they can't do the transportation. Mainly they don't have the hired help, the people to work. Mainly the people aren't taking the jobs, and it's all done shut down. It's a secondary consequence of the ill-advised way they're handling coronavirus, and that has made all the difference in the world, and why GDP is down and people are out of work at a record number. It's man-made. It's not a natural thing. And besides, this is really going to strike the historians when they start looking at the real statistics on how much harm was done. There's plenty of harm done with the virus. There's no doubt about it. But they're going to come down with a conclusion. Maybe we overreacted, which they did. They overreacted, and doing something, encouraging people to take care of themselves, that's okay. But to assume that the government knows exactly what to do and they can correct it by preventing people from doing their job. And this is the reason now. The country's getting nervous about it, but it won't take, hopefully, as they loosen things up, the market will help recover this. The government can't plant crops, and all they can do is pay people to do the wrong thing sometimes. So what they need to do is get out of the way and turn it loose and let the people who are in the business take care of themselves rather than our Department of Agriculture. And if it doesn't work, what have they done already for the last 6-8 months? They've been pouring money, because of the sanctions. The sanctions haven't helped the farmers like it was supposed to do it. So they create problems and then they compensate, and they're obsessed with it in the belief that if there is a problem, government management needs to be imposed, and you need to print a lot of money and everything will be okay. Someday they're going to have to wake up and consider another option. Maybe what we should be considering is not the management of agriculture products. Why don't we consider how can we free up the people to act like they live in a free society and let them solve the problem? That's the way the country became great, but it's also the lack of that that's making us come under severe stress and undermining the liberties that we have. So it's a crucial time in which we live, and I hope we can help straighten some of these things out and not say, well, what we need is just more money to the farmers and the truckers and bail out everybody, because that just compounds the problem.
And as the coronavirus narrative is collapsing, which it is, and not getting these massive death figures even by cooking the books, the fearmongers and the panic mongers need a new thing to make people panic about. First, you got everyone excited about toilet paper, and so everyone went nuts and bought a bunch of toilet paper. And now the new thing is a coming food crisis, and this is a real crisis. But what they're going to try to do, what they are trying to do, is blame it all on the coronavirus. Oh, our food crisis, the coronavirus is affecting our food crisis, but it is not in the way that they're claiming. Here's a quick snapshot of the problem, and it is a real problem. 2 million chickens euthanized in Delaware and Maryland recently, and it's pretty horrific the way they suffocate the animals. Pretty bad stuff. 20 slaughterhouses closed across the U.S., big ones. They warn they may have to kill 700,000 pigs per week. That's not so we can eat pork. They're digging big trenches and just burying all these animals because they can't get them to the slaughterhouses. And here's something from I think it's a Bloomberg piece that explains it a little bit better about what's happening. This action comes as farmers across the country are forced to dump huge quantities of milk and vegetables because of virus concerns, and get this is a quote, and lack of customers, while many Americans wait in line for food handouts. So they want to blame the virus, but the fact is people don't have the money to go buy these things. That's part of the problem as well. So they're going to try to blame it on coronavirus. But here's something else, Dr. Paul, that's interesting. Europe is not having a crisis because they didn't shut down their slaughterhouses. They've maintained. So you can't say this is a unique thing, because you can't claim that Spain and Italy are not hard hit by this coronavirus. They are. But you can't claim that this is something unique to the virus, that they can't kill the animals, because Europe didn't do it and they're not suffering the crisis.
No, it's easy and convenient to dwell on the coronavirus. It's the cause. It distracts from the real cause, and that is excessive spending, excessive debt, and the Federal Reserve manipulation of the economy, the central economic planners. But that is what they ignore. But in the agriculture industry, as in all the industries, once you have decades after decades of artificial interest rates and too much spending and too much debt, the bust to that economy always comes. So whether we had never had the virus or the pretense of the seriousness of the virus, there would have been problems like this, because the economy has been very, very fragile, and it has to unwind, and it can't be patched up by doing more of what we've been doing for decades, and that is destroying the function of value of money, that you don't have a measuring rod to have the definition of the dollar, at the same time really ruining the interest rate, which helps define what investors ought to do, because you have a lot of investors investing in farming, buying land and shipping and all the things that go into it. There's no way, the government can figure that out. They're not economic planners. Every time they've tried it, in hundreds of years, the more central economic planning you have, the worse the conditions get. And I think this is part of that too. It's not the virus per se, but it's the reaction to the virus that really has been the biggest problem, and that meant the shutdown. And now they're arguing, well, we can't open it up because it's chaotic if we do that. What's going on now? That's the chaos. What the market does, and individuals making their own decisions, is they smooth things out. They make decisions, and when mistakes are made, they're eliminated quickly, and it's limited to a small group of people. But when government does it, and even if something like this was going on and the federal government never said a word, there might be some states that would say, hey, look, quarantines aren't totally strange to this country, but the quarantine was supposed to sort of guide us in restraining the person who was spouting off the germs.
Yeah.
Not abusing our liberties. It's sort of like the Patriot Act, because when the Patriot Act came in, the enemy has been the jihadists, the terrorists. So who did they punish? The American people. They took away our liberties as a punishment because they got frightened about the terrorists, and that, of course, too, was also hyped, because they always have to have an enemy. In this case, the virus is the enemy, and they use that as an excuse to do anything they have to do, and there's a rebellion going on, and we've talked about that the last few days. There is a rebellion going on, and the people are annoyed by it, and some some of them say, this is crazy, I want my freedom back, and that's the healthy thing that's happening right now.
Yeah, that's for sure. And you mentioned Jeff Dystar, friend and former colleague. He had a great piece, and we put it up on Ron Paul Institute about will the food crisis finally get people to wake up and demand an end to the lockdown. And he makes a good point, which is that Americans have been living under this delusion because we have the illusion of wealth, as you always talk about, the illusion of being so wealthy. They're operating under this delusion that you can just go home, put on your pajamas, and sit watching Netflix for 2 months, and nothing will happen to the economy, which is a very intricate interworking of human activity. And that is not the case. You can't simply shutter the entire economy and sit home in your PJs and think nothing's going to happen. So, well, something is happening this week, and earlier this week, the head of Tyson's, the CEO of Tyson's, warned we're going to have some food shortages. It's coming. It's going to be serious. Representative Massey, our good friend, has warned of this for a few weeks now, and he's a cattle rancher too. He's seen this. So this is what happened this week. Trump signed an executive order allowing slaughterhouses to remain open. The press says ordering them to remain open. That's not really the case when you look at the fine print, which is very difficult to get in the mainstream media. But what is keeping them from remaining open? You think, well, they want to stay open, they want to make money, that's what they're in the business for doing. The problem is an issue of liability. And for all the other things they're talking about why they're not open, there's an issue of liability. There are some workers that have tested positive, and out of an abundance of caution, of fear of the liability, they've just shut the whole thing down. What's happened. So I think, as I understand President Trump's executive order, it is to remove some liability from these companies for having workers that may have tested positive being on the assembly line, and that's the reason why the heads of the big Smithfield, Tyson's, and the other praise the executive order, because they do want to get back to work. So there is it's not a virus. It's a liability issue that's kept them closed.
That's right. I do want to talk a little bit about a bit of hope coming out of how the shutdown is being handled. And it's obvious it's starting to break and we're starting to open up, but everybody is frightened and everybody's demagoguing it, and the legal people are involved, the politicians are involved. But there's been news about Sweden.
Yeah.
And this is interesting because Sweden took a different approach. They didn't ignore it, but they emphasized voluntarism. They had suggestion, and the cooperation between the suggestions coming from their government and the people seemed to work pretty well. And now that they're talking about opening up, it was WHO, who was actually condemning Sweden for not doing what we tell them to do, lockdown, because, just for practical reasons, if nothing else. So they now are saying, hey, now that we're opening up, since the economy isn't doing so badly in Sweden, maybe we ought to look at what they were doing. Maybe we should follow that. Of course, they do plenty of digs at Sweden. They don't talk about how they made them, or how the other countries failed to maintain their economy. But they're saying now that maybe as we make progress, maybe we should look to some of the examples that Sweden set. And it's not a bad idea. It's not exactly a libertarian approach to it, but they emphasize voluntarism. And that's a big step than the authoritarianism that we're putting up with. And, and it's contagious, this authoritarianism. We have a president says something, and then we have the state saying something. Then the mayors will say something, and then the county judges will say something. And it just goes on. And the one question that is barely ever asked is, where do they get the authority to do that? And they suggested that if there's a complication, you have to have government there. But there is no authority for people to get a lockdown, to say you can't leave your house or you can't go to church. And yet that is totally ignored. Well, I can't say totally. We do have some fighters out there and some people who will go to church.
Yeah.
But then what happens when they do that and say, well, I'm going to open up my store, some local person say, you do that, we're going to come with an arrest warrant. We're going to arrest you and intimidate and put fear into them. They already have fear about the virus, and nobody can be absolutely sure, if any of the fear-mongering is true or not. But the fear-mongering by our government is very true, and they know our government will come and crack down on. For what, 15, 20 years now, all you had to say, terrorist, 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 and you could get anything you wanted, any finances or any abuse of civil liberties. You never get rid of the Patriot Act. You always build on this, and that is what we're doing now. This whole situation, they didn't even have to have Congress pass this modern-day Patriot Act because the authority was just there. The bailouts don't need appropriations. The Federal Reserve continues on their way of just bailing out everybody. But Sweden did it differently, and they're looking at it. I would say that's a positive, and I hope there's more momentum with more people looking at it and sorting it out.
And this is a piece we both saw in the New York Post where it says, the World Health Organization is flip-flopping. Sweden was damned for not doing a total lockdown like France and Italy and Spain and the UK eventually did. They went toward more voluntary measures. They decided to take closer care of the most vulnerable sectors of society. They kept the schools open. They kept the restaurants open. There were limitations on the size of gatherings. So they didn't sit back and do nothing, but they relied more on voluntarism. And the top emergency expert for the World Health Organization, Dr. Mike Ryan, is quoted in the article as saying, quote, there are lessons to be learned from Sweden, from the way Sweden did it. This is a real departure from how they treated Sweden before, but Sweden is not different. We have a few laboratories that are available for us to study and to decide, and we've covered this several times on the show, what is the appropriate response. There were 8 U.S. states that did not go into lockdown, including our friends in South Dakota, Governor Kristi Noem, who didn't hardly anything in their state. If the claim that lockdown is absolutely essential, we say this over and over again, then there should be a mass disparity between deaths in Sweden and in these 8 U.S. states and the rest of the states and countries that did lockdown. Well, we don't see that. Sweden has suffered quite a few deaths. Unfortunately, most of those are happening in senior homes, where you do have a lot of other problems, and they've admitted we've really failed our seniors. That's our biggest failing. But they haven't occurred across the population, and they haven't occurred in the U.S. states that have not had lockdowns. So how can you continue to justify locking down the economy when you don't see this death disparity between states and countries that do? And there is an economy to go back to in Sweden. They're still holding business. I can't tell you how many restaurants and different businesses are closed forever here in the U.S.
Isn't it ironic? Today we have a very strong militant socialist movement, probably the strongest since the Depression times, and when you confront anybody who's this strong believer in socialism, they say, "Well, that's not what we mean. We don't mean Soviet communism. What we mean is something like Swedish socialism." They got to thinking, well, here they're setting the example of the least authoritarian approach to this problem, and they didn't fall a trap into this. So they're saying, the Swedish government says a lot less, and they're doing better. At the same time, our people are saying, do it the way the Swedes do it. So Sweden has some socialist policies, just as we do, but it turns out they were the best on the market approach. I love it when they use there's a problem out there. We have a government. Maybe the government will give us a few suggestions, but there were no thugs out there with guns that said that if you don't have a mask on your face, we're going to put you in jail. So it's to me very interesting that Sweden, as an example of socialism, is not quite accurate, because in the past I've seen some comparisons that some of their tax laws and other things, they don't hate free markets. I mean, here they're the strongest defender of the free market, dealing with a problem that just cropped up and was affecting everybody.
Yeah, they've done a good job. But there are some naysayers in Sweden, and I want to get this in because I'm afraid you might not say it. We both talked about this when we were talking about the show. Here's Cecilia Sonderberg-Naukler, a professor at the Karolinska Institute. She's furious with her fellow Swedes. We must establish control over the situation. We cannot head into a situation where we get complete chaos. No one has tried this route. What she's saying, no one has tried the route of not locking everyone down. Well, the lockdown is unprecedented in history, locking down healthy people in hopes that they won't get the disease.
How about the few examples in our country, more examples that they've tried the opposition, and that is free markets.
Yeah.
That's how the more we discovered that in our early history, the more growth there was, the better off the middle class was. So it's been tried. It's this thing that is abnormal. They want you to think what they're doing is normal, and if you release things, you get your chaos. But no, the chaos comes from the government. The chaos doesn't come from voluntarism. But people say, well, it was imperfect. So-and-so did this, and he had a problem. But then it's very limited. It's limited usually to the individual or a small number of people who make the mistakes. But when you put a Fauci in charge of things, and when he makes a mistake and gets financed by Bill Gates, I'll tell you, the problems are greatly magnified, and that's what we're suffering from. So we have the virus, we have the lockdown, then we have these individuals who are writing the message, the scenario, and the rules and all. But even through all that, we see people saying, enough is enough. We want our freedom back again. We want less chaos. Because how could anything be more chaotic than this, of this government and our country closing down in days, one day? How could anybody have accomplished that other than the participation of people that probably were anxious to have this happen, because they must have had a little bit of common sense to say that if we make this announcement, everybody has to stay home and nobody goes to work. Well, yeah, they can sell that. We'll send you a check every week, but right before they know it, the checks don't come and the money loses its value. People know that can't last forever. But that was it. You always get people dependent, and then create a lot of fear, intimidate them, and try to squelch the resistance. The resistance is breaking out, so we encourage the people to speak out, but you have the authoritarians now that are going to be more aggressive. We can't let them get away with this. They'll become in charge of their own lives. They'll be able to go to work when they want to. Yeah. So it's a crucial time and something that people have to realize. What we do now as a nation, as a people, and understanding is going to maybe play a real huge role in what kind of a country we have in 5 or 10 years from now, because we have had this terrible blip downwards, but there is theoretically a recovery for this, even though that is going to be tough. But the talk has to be not better management by our government, more spending money, more credit from the Federal Reserve. If it stays there, I'll tell you what, this is going to be a long time going. And I would think if we're annoyed by people being arrested because they don't have their mask on, it's going to be a lot worse than that if we don't get a handle on this. But that's why we need to encourage the people that are waking up and say, boy, you're right, this thing is crazy. It's not making any sense. And now even counting, this, I've said this so many times, it's so annoying that the data that they're following is fudged. Yeah. The people who die. And the refusal to, or the mandate that you have to put coronavirus down on your death certificate, even though they've never tested positive, never even tested at all. Oh, he looks like he could have. And then again, if you finance corruption, you get more of it. So the hospitals, everybody gets payment from the government, triple payment if they've had coronavirus. I mean, it's a hysteria that is out of control. We need to be brought down to our senses, and hopefully we can get enough people to prod our country to get back on track.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to start my closing statement with try to do some good news. What can we do? How can we solve the problem? Food crisis is coming. There is one solution, and we've talked about it before, Thomas Massey's Prime Act. The problem isn't that there are not enough processors out there to process meat and get it to us and get it on our table. There are plenty of them. The problem is the incredible government regulation, USDA and government regulation of the processors. And what that does is it freezes out any competition and only lets the big, huge processing companies go through. Well, Thomas Massey's act would help the small meat processors fill the gap, put food on our table. And that's actually something that's in tune with President Trump's philosophy and behavior so far, which is reducing regulations. So he should take a look at that act and take a look at a way to solve the problem. Unfortunately, there are other things that I don't have great news about in my closing. Just an update on our show. Yesterday we talked about the Bad S bar that was, she put something on Facebook, I got to open my bar, I'm losing my business. Well, unfortunately, the authorities tracked her down and said if you open it, you're going to get arrested. So that's not a good news story. We don't know what's going to happen. She got in touch with us, and she's very worried about what's happening. Brazoria County has had a total of 2 coronavirus deaths. That's tragic, but does that justify ruining this woman's business and so many other businesses like it? It really is terrible. And I just want to finally say one thing. My nominee for Villain of the Week, Dr. Paul, has got to be Gavin Newsom, the governor of California. You know, there was a guideline, you can't go to the beach. Well, people in Orange County and LA County, they had a nice warm weekend. And you cannot I'm a Californian. You can't keep a Californian away from the beach when the weather's nice. So they swarmed to the beaches. They ignored the governor. And that's the worst thing you can do to a tyrant. They ignored his order. So he stamped his feet, stamped his hands, and screamed, and now he issued another proclamation. Don't you dare go on that beach. You were going to be arrested. You're going to go to jail. So the wonderful thing about people like the Californians and others, when they see a tyrant, they just ignore it, and that's the one thing they can't stand.
You know, there's been a lot of people in the news talking about the discomfort of being locked down, and they're figuring out ways which are natural to try to smooth things over, and they're not into this big philosophic debate, and they do more family things which could be, you know, very, very helpful and solve some of these problems. But I think people like Newsom and these other ones, I think they basically have this hatred against people who are having fun. Especially in spite of all of this. Look at what we do to them. They're still having fun. It sort of reminds me when they were throwing the Christians to the lions, you know, you know, the example there. And this is what happened. They're just furious. They're just furious because they think they can still have fun. Well, we'll show them. They can't go out in the sun because the sun might help them, and that's not what we're here for. But the British had a report here this week, and it said that the lockdown is going to cause, in their estimation, 18,000 cancer deaths in a year. I don't know where they get the figure. I don't know if they're accurate, but I would suggest that some of that has to be true because we've reported on here. I know of it happening. You see it even on the evening news, but they don't blame the government for closing down all the hospitals. In spite of all this, hospitals are empty and respirators are sitting there. There's so much misdirected energy and absolutely terrible planning that they've done. But 18,000 deaths because of the coronavirus, because people miss their appointments, they don't get checked, people don't go in, and it's other than cancer too. We've heard the stories about heart attacks and others. People are just frightened to go to the hospital. So if they wanted fear and intimidation, they have it. And then if you try to it, then you end up with the government getting tougher, like Daniel just pointed out. The law comes down and say, if you do it, we're going to put you in jail. So they have this additional worry, and then they're probably just trying to struggle to make a couple dollars to take care of their families, and they get intimidated with these thugs who want to put you in prison for this. And yet the whole thing is, it was voluntary in Sweden, and the truth of this is that if two people can make up their own minds in a voluntary way, you can still protect yourself. The fact that you don't get a shot, now the next big fight will be when there's about 72 different shots to pick from, but the government will decide which one you have to take or you'll never get on an airplane again. We need to get you a vaccine for this, even though we may not ever see the coronavirus again, or we may never fully understand how dangerous it really was. But it's going to be with fear and intimidation and threat of prison. They want power and control, and if you're free and prosperous and independent, it doesn't go well with dictators. And right now, if anything, this episode of what's been going on these last several months indicate the authoritarians are alive and well at the local level too. It isn't just, you know, our administration and our Congress, as bad as they are at being poor in leadership, and they promote it and prod people. Actually, the real problem comes from the law enforcers who said that we're going to arrest you, and the stories are out there, and that's why people are saying, I'm going to the beach anyway. But you know, you have to see what's going to happen, because they have a lot more guns than we do. And the answer is not for us to have more guns. That has to be the really the very last desperate approach to trying to solve this problem. What we need is a change in attitude and a better understanding of how we got into this mess, and don't blame, you know, mystical, invisible things like a virus. You know, that makes less sense, and at least people could visualize a little more so a terrorist. But then that definition was expanded to anybody they didn't like. Oh, he's a terrorist. He said something. So it expanded, and that's why this is so dangerous. People just don't have the confidence to know that people can work things out voluntarily, and that's why, in a very simplistic way, this is why Sweden right now is being looked at as maybe having some guidance, because they had the audacity not to put the force of law on the rules and regulations they suggested, and now they are saying, oh, maybe they had something to that. So I think the solution is very simple. Just work toward freedom. Think about the individual owning their own lives. Think about people working things out. Understand that there's always problems, but never having faith and confidence that putting all the power and the control in the hands of the government. That's what the Constitution was supposed to restrain. The Constitution is 90% restriction on the government, and yet what you see now, they don't even need much say by Congress anymore. You know, Congress has been closed, but they keep passing bills and spending money. And when you think about the many trillions of dollars the Federal Reserve can spend without an appropriation or direction, but we have been powerful. We have been we have the reserve currency of the world, and we police the world, and we have an empire. But the big message right now, it's coming to an end. And that's why we have to work very diligently to participate in trying to bring about a society that was once a dream of our founders. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. Please come back soon.